August on BBC Two, Earth and Life meets one of the 20th century's most controversial scientists.
If you're after some of the big questions in science, try these. Why is the Earth like it is today? What was it like before? How has it changed over the millions of years? And what are the processes involved in those changes? For some while now, scientists have been trying to get to grips with the way the whole Earth system works. It isn't easy. The Earth's a big and complex place, and there are lots of theories around. But there's one theory in particular that's so revolutionary that has come out of the realms of academic debate and has captured the public imagination. It's Gaia, the theory named after the Earth goddess. Here's a rare opportunity to see the Gaia theory explained by the man who developed it, James Lovelock. The theory is by no means universally accepted. The scientific community is sharply divided between those who feel that the theory has some merit and those who think that it's just, well, a load of hokum. But before Lovelock developed the Gaia theory, he'd had a long and respected career as a research chemist, and his ideas are certainly controversial.
I see the Earth as more than just a mixture of living things and inanimate matter. I see it as a tightly coupled entity where the evolution of the living things and the evolution of the inorganic matter constitute a single and totally inseparable process. It's a whole system. Somehow or other, life appeared on Earth. I don't give a damn if it was somebody put it here, whether it was a waste bin cast aside by some visiting spacecraft, or whether God fiddled around with the chemicals and started it, or whether it dropped out from space. Somehow or other, it started here. At that time, the Earth must have been just right for life, otherwise it wouldn't have survived. But the Earth was evolving geochemically and quite remorselessly towards, although it would take a long time, a state like Mars or Venus, and utterly impossible for life. So life arrived just at the right moment, so to speak. Gaia is the name that I give to the system that is the Earth. It's also the name of the theory of the Earth as a system, which is, I suppose, saying the same thing in other words. Gaia got its name in the oddest of ways. Many years ago, I used to live in a village called Bowerchalk in southern Wiltshire, and a near neighbour of mine was that novelist William Golding, and he and I were good friends, and we used to go for walks around the village talking about philosophical things and that. And when the idea of Gaia came into my mind, I didn't call it Gaia then, of course, I was telling him about it, how I thought the Earth was a self-regulating system and that the organisms somehow were involved in this process of self-regulation. And he rather liked the idea, and he said to me, well, you better give it a proper name. So I said, what do you suggest? He said, I'd call it Gaia. And for 20 minutes we walked on. I was very puzzled because I thought he'd said the word G-Y-R-E, those great whirls that go round and round in the ocean. And I could see that it was a circular thought that I had in my mind. But I thought Gaia was going a bit far. And then he suddenly said, no, I meant G-A-I-A, Gaia, the Greek name for the Earth goddess. And of course that I accepted.
It all began in the early 1960s. When James Lovelock worked for NASA, which steadily grew obsessed with the search for life on Mars. 10 years before the 1976 Viking spacecraft landings, Lovelock pointed out that life on Mars would have left its signature in the Martian atmosphere, but no evidence for such a signature exists. The relationship between the composition of our atmosphere and life on Earth led to the first detailed formulation of the Gaia hypothesis. It soon became controversial.
The old Gaia hypothesis, as it was first stated, arose like this. What I'd found was that looking at the Earth in the Mars business and discovering this wonderful atmosphere with all of these gases out of equilibrium and yet somehow keeping constant, I knew there was something that was regulating it. And it was natural for me to think that it was life that was doing the regulating, and that it was doing it in such a way as to keep the Earth comfortable for itself.
But what does James Lovelock mean by planetary atmospheres being in and out of equilibrium?
A system in equilibrium is a system in balance, like this weight and these pebbles. Now, a planetary atmosphere is in equilibrium when its composition doesn't change, when there's a balance between its consumption and its production. And there are two ways of doing that. Take Mars. There's very little going on there. The Martian atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide, an inert gas, so there's hardly any interaction between the Martian surface and its atmosphere. So its atmospheric composition doesn't change, and you can regard that as a very stable equilibrium. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, Earth's quite different. Its atmosphere is about 1/5 oxygen, a very reactive gas. And this composition has also changed remarkably little over hundreds of millions of years. But the inputs and outputs of oxygen are very precariously balanced, or in unstable equilibrium. You take life away from the Earth now, and all the oxygen would soon go off and react with something like rocks and disappear, leaving a quite different atmosphere, much more like Mars. So in Lovelock's terms, the Earth's atmosphere is not in equilibrium. Life has tipped the scales and brought in that very reactive gas, oxygen, an atmospheric signature of life, if you like, which is not found on Mars. And it was this notion that drove Lovelock on.
I think few would have come upon it differently when confronted with the evidence that I had then. And so the next few years I went chunnering around looking for evidence that would support this notion that life was regulating the planet and keeping it comfortable for itself. And I was brought up short and sharp by Richard Dawkins and Ford Doolittle's comments that there was just no way that life could regulate anything beyond its phenotype, and this was all nonsense. And this led to the development of the Daisy World model, which showed how, in fact, it wasn't life, but the whole system of life tightly coupled with the physics and chemistry of the planet, with its environment, that did the regulating, with regulating being an emergent property of this tightly coupled system, not something that required purpose or foresight on the part of the organisms. And I think this definitively answered Richard Dawkins' criticism. I think, as another biologist put it even more forcefully than Richard Dawkins, if Gaia is to be real, it would require a trades union of the species of organisms to meet annually on Mount Ararat and negotiate next year's climate, which is clearly absurd. Now, Daisy World was a model that was made to show that the evolution by natural selection, using all of the selfish gene ideas that Richard Dawkins espouses, could, quite naturally, if you coupled the evolution of the organisms tightly with the evolution of their material world, produce a system that was self-regulating. No purpose, no foresight, no planning was needed. Now, the details of Daisy World are like this. I want you to imagine a model planet just like the Earth.
Daisy World is a simple planet. Like the Earth, it orbits a star, which, like our Sun, is getting progressively hotter with age. Unlike Earth, however, Daisy World has a very simple atmosphere with no greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide to warm it up. And it only has two sets of inhabitants, black daisies and white daisies. The black daisies absorb incoming solar radiation, so they warm up, and as they warm up, they radiate heat, warming their surrounding area. The white daisies, on the other hand, reflect sunlight and stay cool. For both colours of daisies, the best temperature for growth is 22.5 Celsius. We'll now see what happens throughout the life cycle of Daisy World as things warm up. At first, Daisy World's young sun is cool, and the planet is rather cold. Here, the heat-absorbing black daisies are at an advantage.
Consequently, by natural selection, dark daisies will be favoured, and at the end of the first season there will be many more dark daisy seeds left than light-coloured ones. So at the start of the next season, dark daisies will be off to a head start and soon will be spreading, warming not just themselves but their immediate locality. And then, with explosive, positive feedback, dark daisies will spread right across the planet and warm it right up to temperatures close to those comfortable for the growth of daisies.
The black daisies thrive and slowly spread out from the warmer equatorial regions until they cover most of Daisy World, turning it black. The blacker it gets, the better Daisy World absorbs heat. As the temperature gets nearer the optimum for all daisies, life gets easier for the white daisies, who then flourish. At first, they grow best at the warm equator. Then they slowly move out, living alongside the black daisies. But in areas of high solar radiation, the white daisies do better as they cool their environment. Whereas in areas of low solar radiation, black daisies predominate by warming their environment. In all areas, the number of black compared to white daisies depends on the proportion of heating or cooling necessary to maintain the optimum growth temperature.
I have no doubt that by far the most important thing to come from Daisy World was the mechanism that it offered to explain how the Earth regulates its temperature. You see, Gaia was not acceptable to most scientists, geochemists, biologists, or anybody else, without a mechanism that explained how it could work. It seemed to them just pure moonshine, nothing solid about it. It was rather like plate tectonics, the theory of Wegener's theory. Until a mechanism was available, nobody could believe there was anything in it. And the same was true for Gaia. And Daisy World gave just that mechanism.
But Daisy World's sun is still getting hotter. And soon the black daisies find it hard to cope. Whilst the white ones stay cool, the white flowers soon outnumber the black ones, and Daisy World becomes whiter and whiter. The white planet reflects the increasing solar radiation and stays cool, but the sun gets hotter still. Eventually, it gets too hot, and even the white daisies can't cope. Daisy World dies.
In a way, Daisy World resembles a living organism. I know biologists hate me for suggesting such a thing, but it does, and perhaps the way in which it most resembles it is that it can die. If the sun gets too hot the star gets too hot for Daisy World, then even a total cover with light-coloured daisies is insufficient to keep the planet cool enough for them to survive. And at the moment some of them start dying, darker bare ground is exposed, and then again, with explosive positive feedback, the temperature zooms upwards, far beyond the range of toleration of any kind of life, so it dies.
All the daisies grow best at 22.5 Celsius. The black daisies work with the sun and warm up the planet, and this is positive feedback. White daisies work against the sun and cool the planet, and that's negative feedback. On Daisy World, we're interested in the combined effects of both positive and negative feedback. This graph represents the temperature of Daisy World based on changes in solar luminosity alone, without the influence of the daisies. If we now add the daisies, we get this curve, which shows both positive feedback from the black daisies and negative feedback from the white ones. Together, they regulate the planet's temperature, producing a stable environment, despite the changes in solar radiation.
I see Gaia theory as a theory of evolution in which in no way discards Darwin's great vision, but includes also the geological evolution of the Earth and couples the two together tightly. What emerges from the synthesis of these two older systems are such properties as self-regulation, that's to say, the regulation of the climate and the chemical composition of the Earth so that it is always a fit place for life.
The Daisy World model is a very general one, and you can play all manner of games with it. We can make it more realistic by giving the daisies a few problems. So let's introduce rabbits to feed on the daisies. At first, the rabbits would try to eat all of the daisies, but as the daisies became scarcer, the rabbits would starve. As a result, the rabbit population would decline. If then the daisy population recovers, this will be followed by a recovery in the rabbit population. This is another example of the positive and negative feedback system which balances out over time. So if the rabbit population fluctuates like this, the daisies correspond like this. During these population cycles, there appear to be runaway increases and decreases in the number of rabbits or daisies. But when measured over a long period of time, a balance or equilibrium is achieved between the number of daisies and the number of rabbits living on them. This balance means that the rabbits have little effect on the long-term well-being of Daisy World. The same long-term balance will still be achieved even if we introduce other disturbances. We could let in foxes to prey on the rabbits, or have a plague to kill off a high percentage of the daisies, or competition between daisies of different colours, or whatever we care to invent.
Biologist critics in the early days suggested that if there appeared on Daisy World a grey-coloured daisy that didn't use energy making light or dark pigment, it would have an advantage and would take over the whole scene and regulation would collapse. They called this a cheat. I took them seriously, and I made a Daisy World model in which a grey-coloured daisy was included. And to make things harder for the black and white ones, I taxed them 5% of their growth rate for making pigment. It was most instructive. When the model was run, the dark and light-coloured daisies flourished just as before. The grey ones flourished as well, although interestingly not quite so well as the dark and light ones. You see, it's really quite simple. When it's very cold, only dark daisies are fit to grow. Light and grey ones cannot. When it's very hot, only light daisies are fit to grow. Dark and grey ones cannot. So the grey daisies have their place.
The result of feedback is a zone of quite remarkable temperature stability, despite changes in solar radiation. As the output of the sun varies, the daisies simply respond to the changing conditions, and in doing so, they regulate Daisy World's temperature. The process is entirely automatic.
The most important conclusion I would draw from Daisy World modelling is that it demonstrates that a system such as Daisy World can self-regulate without there being any purpose, foresight or planning or anything built into the system beforehand that would make it do so. The other most important thing I would single out from it, which I would add on to that, is that Daisy World is the mathematical basis of Gaia theory and the explanation of everything that I mean by Gaia. I see the apparent constancy of temperature on Earth throughout geological time, knowing that it is almost certain that the sun has warmed up by something like 30% during that interval, which is a huge increase in output from the sun and enough to change the climate drastically. If it was freezing at the beginning, it should be well on the way to boiling now. If it was comfortable at the beginning, well, it'll be way up. So yes, it is one of the most solid pieces of evidence for a self-regulating system like Gaia being present on the planet.
But the average temperature range the planet regulates to is far more complex than Lovelock originally thought. For example, in the laboratory, marine algae grow best at 20 Celsius, but in the oceans, they're limited to a much lower temperature. Water mixing ensures a healthy supply of nutrients, and the algae flourish. Huge algal blooms can occur, even though the temperature of the water is 10 Celsius lower than the optimum growth temperature.
So this shows that it isn't just the needs of the organisms that determines the temperature of self-regulation, but the needs of the whole system. The geophysics and the needs of the organisms can tightly couple together as a single system.
So far, the Gaia theory seems convincing, but an acid test for any theory is to see how good it is at making predictions.
I suppose the first of them is a strange one because it happened before what was at that stage no more than the idea of Gaia existed. And here I refer to the prediction that Mars was probably lifeless. It was a prediction that was confirmed by the Viking lander, which found there was no life on Mars. Because if you go back to the evidence I've already talked about here, you will see it comes from the assumption that the Earth is a system which has an atmosphere which is self-regulating in the way that I've described.